Hi, everybody. Welcome to Concept 3.1. We're talking about aggregate demand. So now we're looking at the demand and the supply for the economy as a whole. So instead of just looking at the demand for, I don't know, bananas or the demand for coffee or the demand for any market, we're looking at all demand in our entire economy for all things that are being purchased, right? So aggregate demand or AD can also be said as all demand or AD. Same idea there, right? Aggregate demand is all demand in our entire economy, and it's got a slightly different metric, so let's get into it. If you like writing definitions down, you can write this one down. It's right there for you. It is a downward sloping curve, just like regular demand, that indicates that people collectively desire to purchase all of the goods and services based on price level, right? When price level is really high, then people demand very little of our expenditures or our goods and services. When price level is very low, people demand a whole lot of our overall GDP, our Sig Jixin, for example, right? So that's our aggregate demand. And it's going to be broken down into the four elements that you know and love called Sig Jixin, but it really is just a curve that represents the changes in spending based on changes in price level. Okay, so downward slope, here we go. We just talked about this. This is very similar to the law of demand. As price level decreases, notice I'm not just using price, I'm using price level. So this is actually CPI, our consumer price index there, right? So it's all prices in our entire economy. Notice our x-axis down here is not quantity, it's real GDP. So it is all quantity or all goods produced within the borders of our nation in a given year, right? So when we're talking quantity, it's a quantity of all goods, real GDP. When we're talking price level, so prices of all goods or CPI, price level. That's what we call it. Okay, so as price level goes down, we want more of our overall GDP. And when price level goes up, we demand less of our overall GDP, less of our goods and services for consumption, and our capital goods for investment, and our public goods for government spending, and our foreign goods with net exports. That's really aggregate demand. Downward sloping, and instead of labeling it just D, we label it AD for aggregate or all demand. Okay, let's keep going. So when we have this curve here, notice that we label price level on the y-axis, real GDP on the x-axis. You'll get used to that. Then we have aggregate demand downward sloping right there. So aggregate demand is the demand by consumers, consumption, businesses, investment, government, and foreign countries, net exports. So it is completely accurate to say aggregate demand is equal to Sig Jixin. Aggregate demand is equal to the demand of consumers for consumption goods. It is equal to that plus the investment, the demand for businesses for inventory, new construction, and for capital goods. It is the demand for government to purchase goods to share with the public, so those public goods, and foreign nations and net exports. So aggregate demand is Sig Jixin, and Sig Jixin is aggregate demand. It's all four of those things. Okay, now let's talk about the downward slope of aggregate demand. I do not know why ACDC Econ likes this so much. Not ACDC, College Board likes this concept so much, but they always ask a question about downward sloping. So why is aggregate demand downward sloping? Down demand. Well, it is not, notice the title here, is not because of the income effect, which is why it's downward sloping in a market, right? Because when price level falls, our income actually follows that. Because when price level goes down, right, businesses aren't able to sell their goods for the same prices as they did before. They lose money. So what do? They lower the wages for their workers the next time they can renegotiate that. So it's not the income effect. In fact, when price level goes up, we all get poorer than we were before, right? And price level goes down, eventually our wages are going to follow. Okay, so it's not the income effect. It is also not the substitute effect. You can't substitute an aggregate. When price level goes up, we don't just sub out all of our GDP for something else. How do you sub out all of our consumption and all of our investment, all of our government spending? You can't do it. So it is not the two reasons that demand is downward sloping are not the same two reasons that aggregate demand is downward sloping. You have to decipher between the two. So it is downward sloping for a few reasons. Reason number one is something we call the real balances effect or the wealth effect. The wealth effect works like this. When prices go up, we are all poorer Because we are poor, we're going to demand less, fewer of all the goods and services. We're going to demand less consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports because we're poor. Think of it, we talked about this with real wages, right? Nominal minus inflation equals real. So when inflation's going up, price levels rising on that y axis, it's going up. We are all getting poorer, so we're going to demand less. So that gives us that downward sloping. When we're up at the top of the curve, price level is very high, but our demand for GDP is very, very low. And vice versa, when price level falls, we are all wealthier. Because we are wealthier, we buy more goods and services at every level. All of this Jackson. Okay, that's the first one. Probably the easiest one to remember. The second one is interest rates effect. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now, but we'll cover this in Unit 5. I promise you, we'll get to it. But right now, let's just hit it because it's one of the reasons demand is downward sloping, or aggregate demand is downward sloping. It's called the interest rates effect, and it works like this. When price level goes up, things are more expensive. People like you and me, we need more money to buy goods and services. There's actually a market for money. So when I need more money for goods and services, then the demand for money, as I showed here, goes right. I need more money. Well, when the demand for money goes right, the price of money goes up, right? Just like when the demand for bananas goes up, the price of bananas goes up. When demand for money goes right, the price of money rises. What is the price of money? It's interest rates. When interest rates rise, which is the rate that you pay to borrow somebody's money, that's the price of money. Make sense? When interest rates rise as a result of this, right? Demand for money shifts right. There's a higher interest rate. Then businesses are actually going to invest less, and people like you and me are going to spend less. Think of it this way: interest rates impact our purchase of cars. So when interest rates are higher because of inflation, then we're actually going to demand fewer cars. Interest rates affect things we have to borrow money for, like houses. So when interest rates rise, we're going to buy fewer houses. Interest rates affect things like purchase of major factories or capital goods. Businesses have to spend a ton of money on those things. When interest rates rise, the loans to purchase those things are less attractive, so businesses invest less. All that to say, when price level rises, interest rates rise at the same rate, and as a result, aggregate demand falls, or the quantity of aggregate demand falls. Okay. It is also downward sloping because of the foreign purchases effect. So when prices go up relative to other countries, then when we export those goods, they look relatively more expensive. Other nations aren't going to buy our exports because American goods are super pricey. Their prices are rising. I might as well buy Japanese goods or Korean goods or, Ugandan goods. I don't know what you're buying. So there's actually going to be a lower demand for U.S. exports. Inflation rises, I demand fewer exports, which is a part of GDP. So when demand goes up, I'm at the top of the hill, I demand less of GDP. That creates my downward slope. And when inflation is very low, CPI is low, vice versa. All my goods abroad look really, really cheap. And so other nations are going to buy them. So the demand for foreign goods is going to go up, or the demand by foreigners for our goods are going to go up. So that lowers the net exports portion of demand. Okay, got it? That's a lot, but there we go. So we're going to talk about shifts. We know that a change in price changes quantity demand, movement along the curve. We talked about that with the market. Same thing is applied to our economy as a whole. A change in price level is just going to change the quantity of consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, Sig Jackson, or the quantity of aggregate demand that we actually want to purchase, right? But there are things outside of that that actually affect it, right? So there are two components to any shift. When we change the amount that we want to consume, we change the amount that we want to invest, we change the amount that the government wants to spend, or we change the amount that foreigners want to purchase our goods minus the domestic purchase of foreign goods, net exports. When any one of those four things happen, that's what shifts the curve. Those are our four determinants or shifters of aggregate demand. Okay, Sig Jackson. You spent a lot of time with Sig Jackson in this class. In addition to that, every one of our shifts is going to have a multiplied effect. We're looking at an economy as a whole here. So when aggregate demand shifts a little, when consumption goes up, for example, that money is going to circulate through our economy multiple times. So we don't want to understate it. We want to effectively count how much of an impact a change in consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports is going to have on our economy. Okay, let's get into it. So how do you draw a shift? You draw a shift just like you drew a shift of demand. Notice this has a little bit of a downward bowl here. Doesn't matter. You can draw it completely straight. It's totally fine. So if there's an increase in spending, aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. So if there's an increase in consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports, aggregate demand shifts right. And if there's a decrease in consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports, aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. Those are the two shifters of aggregate demand. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's get into these determinants. The first is consumption, the C of Sig-Jigson, right? Or consumer spending, same thing. So, in the event that people have more disposable income, which is just my income minus taxes, that's what disposable income is. If people have more disposable income, they're going to demand more consumption. So, when people get wealthier, consumption rises. That makes sense, right? In the event that we are borrowing more money, you don't borrow money from a bank unless you intend to spend it. You shouldn't just borrow money from the bank and put it in a savings account. That's a bad idea. Instead, you should borrow it only if you're going to spend it on a car, or borrow it if you're going to spend it on a house, right? Or spend it on college education. So you change borrowing because you want to consume more. So when borrowing rises, consumption rises as well. Change in consumer expectations. If I think the economy is going to do really well in the future, then I'm going to buy more today. But if I fear a recession in the future, I'm going to buy less today, right? We talked about that consumer expectations, the Black Friday effect. Same thing goes for aggregate for our entire economy. So if I expect good things, consumption is going to rise. If I expect bad things, consumption is going to fall, and aggregate demand moves with that change in consumption. Okay, and then finally, tax changes. This goes to disposable income. If people are taxed more, they have less disposable income, our demand is going to shift left. If households are taxed less, they have more disposable income, consumption is going to go up, and aggregate demand is going to shift right. Okay, so thinking logically, this is about the households and the consumers. Investment is all about the businesses. So we're looking at the metrics that could impact whether or not you buy capital goods or purchase more inventory. So real interest rates changing is the largest impact on investment, right? So most businesses look at something called expected rate of return versus interest rates. Expected rate of return is the percentage of money I think I'm going to get back from this investment, right? Interest rate is how much I have to pay to borrow money to make this investment. So it's how much I earn versus how much I pay. If how much I earn is higher, expected rate of return is higher than real interest rates, I'm going to invest, and vice versa. If real interest rates are higher than expected rate of return, I'm going to not invest because I'm not going to make money off of that. So, in the event that interest rates rise and our expected rate of return stays the same, then investment's going to fall. There's an inverse relationship, right? Interest rates rise, we invest less because it's more expensive to borrow money for capital goods. Vice versa, when interest rates fall, we're going to invest more, right? Because it's cheaper to get a loan to make that new factory. My expected rate of returns haven't changed. Speaking of expected returns, if those change, that also impacts our investment. So if we keep interest rates the same, they're stable, and expected rate of returns go up, then I'm going to borrow more because the future looks good. And so investment's going to rise. And vice versa, if interest rates are the same and expected rate of returns start to fall because things look bad in the future, then I'm going to invest less, which is where we're at right now. Investment is very, very low in our economy because the future projections are not great. And so businesses don't want to invest in the future when the future is dismal. Okay. Technology can also dramatically affect these expected rates of returns. Just think of the impact that, universally installed Wi-Fi had on the productivity of businesses. Of course, I'm going to install Wi-Fi. Why wouldn't I spend to do that? Right. And so there's new investment in these new technologies as well. And then capital capacity, we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but capital capacity is, hey, do I have enough or more capital? Will more capital actually make me more productive in the future? There is such thing as actually being at capacity, meaning I have 4 workers and I have 4 computers. Buying a 5th computer isn't going to change productivity all that much. Buying a 6th computer isn't going to change productivity that much. I'm at capacity. If you're at capacity, you're less likely to invest. If you're below capacity and you could have gains from having a new computer, so if I have 4 workers and only 3 computers, it makes sense to invest. So the expected return will be higher on that. Okay. And then, of course, business taxes impact these returns. When I tax businesses more, they're going to invest less. When I tax businesses less, they're going to invest more. I think a key takeaway here is just think about how profitable this is going to be for the business to invest, right? From the business's perspective, if we're investing more, aggregate demand is going to shift right. If we invest less, aggregate demand shifts left. And it's about interest rates, the cost of investment, versus rates of return, the profits of investment. If any one of those is impacted, it's going to impact investment overall. Government is pretty simple. When the government decides to spend more money but doesn't change taxes, right? Oftentimes, when the government says, hey, we're doing this new thing, people say, hey, how are you going to pay for it? And they say, hey, we're going to increase taxes. That doesn't actually move the needle, right? Because a change in government spending shifts aggregate demand to the right. An increase in taxes impacts consumption and investment, and they'll shift aggregate demand back to the left. Okay? So, whenever there is deficit spending, when the government's spending money, but they're not raising taxes, meaning they're going into debt, that's what actually shifts aggregate demand to the right. Government spends more money is flowing through our economy. Oftentimes, this is our last resort. We have to use the government to spend because nobody else will spend. And the government is the only one that is able to and able to go into debt, and it won't severely impact our economy, at least today, and could have a positive impact. Okay. Final one, net exports, XN. How does that impact it? Well, if other nations have more money, then they're going to buy more of our exports. And when they buy more of our exports, aggregate demand is going to shift to the right because net exports is going to rise. Okay, so that's good. In fact, this is one of the main reasons the United States is so involved in nation building around the world. Sure, we care. Yes, we're compassionate, but our economy will thrive in the event that we have more other nations have higher incomes. They'll demand our goods and services as a result. And then there's something called exchange rates, which is actually, when I exchange US currency for Canadian currency, for example, those exchange rates impact it. So when we have the depreciation of the American dollar, so the value of the dollar is less, it actually makes our goods and services that we export look more attractive, right? Because in Canada, they can buy more American dollars with their Canadian dollars. And so the price of our goods is actually cheaper for Canadians because our dollar is valued less. Big takeaway, that's like a whole unit there. The big takeaway is when our currency is devalued, investment or exports are going to rise. And when our currency is valued or appreciates, then net exports are going to fall. So a lot of times they say, hey, the power of the dollar is falling, and everybody says that's bad. It actually is good for our aggregate demand and shifts it to the right because our goods and services are going to look less expensive and more attractive in the international markets. That's aggregate demand. Big takeaways. Know the three reasons aggregate demand is downward sloping. Know that aggregate demand is made up of four elements, Sig-Jigsaw. Know those four elements are the main shifters of aggregate demand, and then know what can impact consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports and how it's going to shift. When we get in class, we'll do some examples of these shifts together. But until then, good luck on your Khan Academy, and I will see you